Star Trek, Mission to Horatius, Chapter 8, Mysteries Solved. The three combatants from the Enterprise had been equipped with leather gladiators' kilts and with sandals suitable for working in the sand of the arena. They stood now at the far end of an oval enclosure, which was smaller than the Colosseum of ancient Rome, but remarkably like that arena of death where man and beast had died in countless thousands for the entertainment of the Roman mob. There were few observers here, however, besides the technicians operating TV cameras, which were spaced every few feet along the wall. This fray was obviously going to be covered from every angle possible. It wasn't every day the managers of the Bavarian Palace Arena had opponents from the stars to perform. There was a small spectator's box halfway down the arena and perhaps 15 feet above the sand. Large enough to hold only a score of people, it was now being occupied by Nummer Ein, his daughter Anna, and a dozen or so of what were obviously his immediate staff. They were laughing and chattering among themselves as they took their places. Janice Rand said softly, "I didn't think the girl, Anna, was quite the type who would enjoy this sort of spectacle." "She isn't," Kirk said. However, he didn't go into what Nummer Ein's daughter had told him at the reception. For all he knew, the Bavarians had sensors that were delicate enough to be picking up their every word. Scott grumbled, "I still think it's my job to be in there instead of Grang." "No," Grang said strongly. "I am Grang of—" I know, lad," Scott growled. "You're Grang of the Wolves." "Our opponents seem to be with us," Spock said. Emerging from a metal door at the arena's far end were the uniformed Bavarian officer who had informed them of the combat, several ring attendants, and three doppelgangers attired in garb identical to that of the Enterprise group. The newcomers made a parade of it, winding up in front of Nummer Ein and his party. Dr. McCoy said wryly, "Caesar, we who are about to die salute you." "Do we have any special strategy, Captain?" Spock asked. In his gladiator kilts, his lithe muscles were more than usually accentuated. Kirk shook his head. "It's man for man. The smallest of them seems to be on the right. He's yours, Grang. I'll stand in the middle. You on the other side, Mr. Spock. If you're successful in finishing off your man, go immediately to the assistance of whichever one of us might need it." Somewhere, unseen trumpets sounded, and the three doppelgangers turned stolidly and began marching in the direction of the Enterprise champions. "This is it," Kirk said tersely. "Spread out, Grang, Mr. Spock. Remember, this is a primitive battle, nothing barred. As of this moment, you have stopped being gentlemen." The Bavarians came in at a rush, slightly crouching, arms extended. They were obviously experienced hand-to-hand fighters. Suddenly, Grang, the Neolithian, screamed his tribal war cry and dashed forward to meet his foe. The scream fell off into a dog-like barking, and Grang was upon him before the slower-moving Bavarian could recover from his surprise at the noisy attack. Kirk and Spock stared, momentarily fascinated. Then they had to tear their eyes from this development as they too closed with the foe. James Kirk threw himself into the karate 14th kata. As his opponent put up his guard, Kirk rushed him with a left-hand block to the Bavarian's right arm. Without warning, with his right hand open, palm to the outside, he struck his opponent's face across the left jaw as his hand slipped around the other's neck. In the background, he could hear Grang's voice yell, "Cool!" But he had no time to check on how his associates were doing. Captain Kirk's opponent was obviously unacquainted with judo, either of the Kenpo or the allied karate type. With the back of his hand, Kirk forced the burly Bavarian's head down toward him as he went down briefly on his left knee, and then came up fast with an uppercut punch to the other's chin. He jumped back, turned slightly to the side, and lashed out with his foot into the enemy's midsection. Even as his opponent was falling, James Kirk spun to the right with the intention of hurrying to Grang's assistance. However, Grang's own enemy was thrown up against the arena wall and was lying in an awkward, grotesque position, and Grang was plowing through the sand in the captain's direction as though he intended to come to Kirk's aid. The two of them turned in Spock's direction. The Vulcan hadn't as yet finished off his man, but there was no question of how matters were going. Larger than Spock, the doppelganger might be, but the Vulcan's reflexes were so much faster that he was making mincemeat out of the slow-moving professional wrestler. Using his hands as choppers, judo fashion, the first officer would step in quickly, slug the other across the neck or face, and step back again before his opponent could retaliate. It was a brutal sight to watch. Kirk put a hand on Grang's arm. "We're not needed," he said dryly, "and the television audience will get the message more strongly if we don't intervene." Grang nodded. "Mr. of the Spocks can take care of himself," he agreed. And even as he spoke, the eyes of the sole remaining doppelganger foe rolled upward, and he sank unconscious to the sand. As though rehearsed, the three victors turned and faced the box where sat Numer Ein and his group. Whatever reaction they had expected from his all-highest, they certainly didn't receive it. Numer Ein was beaming down at them, almost as though in congratulation. Even as a group of ring attendants filed onto the sands and began picking up the fallen Bavarians and hustling them from the arena, Numer Ein said unctuously, "The end of round 1." Captain Kirk stared up at him. "The end of round 1? "That is correct," Numer Ein nodded. "When all the members of one team have fallen, 1 minute of rest is taken, and then the next round resumes." 1 minute of rest, Kirk said in disgust. "If you think any one of those 3 men is going to come back into this arena in 1 minute, you've got a surprise coming." He turned back to where Dr. McCoy was giving both Grang and Spock a quick once-over. "You seem all right," McCoy said. "That was quick work, Jim. Now what happens?" What happened came as a shock to the spacemen. The trumpet sounded as before. Numer Ein smiled down. "And now we have round 2. And the 3 recently defeated doppelgangers marched back into the ring, seemingly as fit and aggressive as ever. Kirk, Spock, and Grang could only stare as the 3 Bavarian champions came in at a lumbering run, each heading for the Enterprise man who had sent them to the sands but 1 minute earlier. There was no time to plan the battle. Captain Kirk fell into the 9th kata position. His opponent threw a vicious right punch, and Kirk grabbed his wrist with his left hand. It was the same man, all right. For a brief moment, the captain had suspected that Numer Ein was ringing in a new fighter on him, but he was sure it was the same one. Kirk walked in and grabbed the man's right shoulder with his right hand, slugging him at the same time in the chin with an elbow punch. Simultaneously, he moved in quickly with his right foot. Coming around to the Bavarian's right leg and kicking forward against the man's leg, he toppled him expertly onto the sand. The other grunted in pain and attempted to roll out, but Kirk didn't release the Bavarian's wrist. Instead, he held him and gave him a heel stamp straight to the solar plexus. Somewhere in the background, he could hear Grang making his dog-like war cry, but there was no time to see how the youngster was doing. Still holding the wrist lock, Kirk came down on the fallen doppelganger, chopping the man's Adam's apple as he struggled to rise. He came to his feet, breathing deeply. "All right," he panted. "That's the end of round 2. Let's see you come out for round 3, mister." The other merely looked up at him. Kirk whirled and headed in the direction of the youthful Neolithian. This time, young Grang wasn't doing so well. In spite of Grang's youthful agility, the Bavarian had managed to get a strong hold and was slowly bending the boy backward. Kirk gritted his teeth and muttered, "We have stopped being gentlemen," and came up behind the doppelganger and kicked him sharply behind the left kneecap. The man screamed and went down and stayed there. Kirk and Grang, both panting now, turned to hurry in the direction of Spock. However, as before, the Vulcan dominated his opponent with his faster reflexes. It was simply a matter of avoiding the other's bull-like rushes, slowly chopping him down with rights and lefts to the man's face and giving judo blows wherever opportunity presented. By the time Captain Kirk and Grang reached the scene, the Bavarian had once again sunk unconscious to the sands, but even Spock was puffing now. The ring attendants filed in once more, this time with stretchers, and began gathering up their champions. Numer Ein laughed down at them. "Very well done, Herren, but we will see how you fare in round 3, or perhaps you will last until round 4. Dr. McCoy came hurrying up, his face worried. This time his charges were not untouched, although they had suffered no serious injuries. Janice Rand had acquired water for them somewhere. She fussed over the boy, who was in worse shape than either Kirk or Spock. Grang panted, Captain of the Kirks." Kirk looked at him worriedly. Grang said, It was not the same man." Kirk scowled. "Are you sure? Mine was the same." Grang tried to catch his breath. "He looked the same, Captain of the Kirks. But he was not. He was perhaps a twin of the first one. But in the first fight, I counted coup on the enemy by striking him across the face with my hand. It caused a slight cut beneath the eye, but this man now, he had no cut. McCoy said, "Perhaps they applied an astringent back in the arena sickbay or wherever they cart those brutes." But Kirk was scowling. "They didn't have time to give them much in the way of medical treatment," he muttered. The trumpet sounded, and the three Bavarians trotted back into the ring and headed for the Enterprise team. The eyes of the group from space bugged. Kirk blurted, "But I was certain he wouldn't be able to come back." "Most interesting," Spock said. He looked at his commander. "I also was of the opinion that my foe would be unable to return. But that is he, unless I am mistaken, charging toward us. He has a mole on the side of his nose." The teams clashed again, but this time the Enterprise group moved more slowly. The pace was beginning to tell. Captain Kirk circled his opponent, who was seemingly as fresh as ever. Certainly as fresh as he had been 15 minutes before when he had entered the ring the first time. Numer Ein shouted down jovially, "You seem to have lost some of your elan, you of the Federation." Kirk didn't bother to look up. He attempted the fifth kata, but the other avoided the karate position and managed to land a shocking punch to Kirk's right shoulder. Kirk shuffled backward in the sand to collect himself. There was no question in his mind but that his opponent was a Bavarian he had faced only moments before. There was no longer time or energy for niceties, nor could James Kirk take the chance of having the other close with him. The Bavarian was a bear of a man, and if once the Earthman allowed himself to be taken into the other's grip, he doubted if he had the strength remaining to triumph. He had to do something quickly and finally. The opponent attempted another slugging punch, which, had it landed, would have brought the starship's captain to the ground. However, Kirk, moving as quickly as he could, stepped in and executed a Kenpo left inside block to the other's punch. Then he moved in quickly with a right forward kick to the opponent's middle. The man grunted in pain, and simultaneously Kirk's right arm shot straight out, and he swept the right hand, edge of hand style, in a whipping manner to the other's larynx. Kirk whirled and shouted up to Numer Ein, as loudly as he could considering his breathlessness, "Unless this man has immediate surgery, he will die." His All-Highest seemed to find some amusement in that statement, and various others in his group even laughed. Kirk had no more time for them, or his fallen enemy. He began plowing in the direction of Grang, who was on the ground trying to cover up as his heavier opponent rained blows and kicks upon him. Once again, the captain came up behind the Bavarian and slugged him with a quick rabbit blow across the back of the neck. When the other had fallen, Kirk helped the Neolithian to his feet. The marks of the strife were obvious on the youngster's face, and he was breathing so deeply that his breath came in gasps. However, he puffed, "Mister of the Spocks," and headed, stumbling, to the assistance of the Vulcan, who was slugging it out, falling back step by step before the onslaught of his seemingly tireless Bavarian opponent. It took the combined efforts of all three to bring the single remaining doppelganger to the sands. Once again, the ring attendants came hurrying out to retrieve the fallen Bavarians. Grang sank to the sand, exhausted. Kirk and Spock stood above him, their chests heaving. McCoy, Scott, and Yeoman Rand hurried up, their faces showing dismay. Numer Ein called down, his voice still jovial, "You seem to lack stamina. Prepare yourselves for round 4. McCoy, his face suffused with anger, stalked over to the area immediately below the box, occupied by his All-Highest, and called, "Captain Kirk and his companions are in no condition to continue this barbaric nonsense." The Bavarian dictator asked in a mocking tone, "You wish to concede?" Kirk took a deep breath and managed an emphatic, "No!" Spock shook his head. "Never." Even Grang, still sitting on the sand, looked up defiantly and gasped, "Members of the Wolf Clan, never surrender." "Very well," Numer Ein chuckled. "We will grant a slight recess of, say, 1 hour. At that time, the game will proceed unless, of course, Captain Kirk, you are now willing to communicate with your ship and turn over your library banks to my technicians." A group of 4 armed doppelgangers marched from an entry and escorted the Enterprise group back to the direction of their cells. The 3 combatants were so exhausted that the others each gave them an arm and help. 1 hour recess. Kirk ground out from between his teeth. Hardly a breather. They preceded their 4 guards down the corridor in the direction of the cells. The cell doors were open, and the 5 men began to file into the one they had been assigned. Suddenly they stopped. Anna Schiekel, daughter of Nummer Ein, emerged from the cell of Janice Rand. In her right hand was a phaser, one of those taken from the Enterprise officers by the Feldherr's men. Her face was expressionless as she brought the weapon up. "Look out!" Scotty yelled, misunderstanding. Coolly and calmly, she leveled the phaser and beamed the 4 guards down. The Federation group stood for a moment in shock. Then McCoy gasped, "But you've just killed those 4 men! Your own people!" She looked at him strangely. "They were only doppelgangers," Kirk said, appalled in spite of the situation. "Despite your class differences here on Bavaria, those were men you cut down. You murdered them." She shook her head. "You don't understand. Don't you know the meaning of the word doppelganger?" "Doppelganger," Spock said. "Of course I know the meaning of the word, a Teutonic term signifying duplicate or copy, but it had not occurred to me." Anna said, extending the phaser toward Captain Kirk. "On Bavaria, we have 2 classifications. The Herr Elite, who are real people, and the doppelgangers, who are duplicated over and over again. We chose, long years past, those most suited to be soldiers, then made them over and over. The same with servants and factory or field hands. Actually, there are only a few tens of thousands of the Herr Elite on all the planet." McCoy was aghast. "The technique is not unknown back on the Federation worlds, but it's certainly not utilized on human beings. Certainly our sensors can completely analyze the composition of any human body, but long ago we discovered that in attempting to duplicate the body, a prime ingredient is missing, that which is called the psyche, or if you wish, the soul, that spark of something which differentiates man from the animal." Kirk said, "These doppelgangers of yours, in short, they're zombies." He'd taken the weapon away from her. Now she produced a communicator from her clothing and handed it over as well. Spock murmured, "Most interesting. Now I see why our Nummer Ein thinks in terms of ultimately challenging even the Federation. He has at his disposal literally unlimited numbers of soldiers." Kirk said to the girl, "And you've revolted against the situation. It was you who sent the call for help. Why?" "Why?" she asked, a sad, somewhat wistful quality in her voice. "Possibly because once I loved my father." "Your father?" Grang growled contemptuously. She looked at the boy. "My real father. You see, Nummer Ein is not my father. He is a doppelganger of my father, who I am sure is now dead. I am the only one who knows it among the Herr Elite. But Nummer Ein himself is a soulless copy of a real man. And now, if you will all follow me." She led the way down the corridor in the opposite direction from that from which they had just come. Kirk said, a question in his voice, "And out there in the arena, those 3, doppelgangers we just fought?" "You didn't fight 3, of course, but 9 copies of 3 men, which is the reason why Nummer Ein was so amused. You see, Captain, he could have sent in 90 or even 9,000 for that matter. Perfect duplicates." They hurried after her. "Where are you going? What is your plan?" Kirk demanded. She said over her shoulder, "We are going to the duplicating banks. There's but one set. Long ago our technicians lost the ability to build new ones." That meant nothing to the men from the Enterprise, but they saved their short breath. They soon lost their sense of direction in the maze of halls and corridors. The total area of the palace of Nummer Ein was even greater than they had previously estimated. At long last, they came to a bank of early-type elevators and hustled into one. Anna spoke into a tube, and the chamber began to rise. A robot voice said, "You are entering the forbidden rooms. Identify yourselves immediately, or you will be destroyed." This was evidently no problem. Anna held up her hand to a small viewing screen so that the fingerprints could be read. The voice was heard no more. She was, after all, Anna Schiekel. They emerged into a gigantic hall of electronic equipment and long banks of files. "Here you are," she said. Kirk looked at her, puzzled. "What is your plan?" She shook her head. "I have none. I was forced into immediate action by your situation, and I had no time. Nummer Ein planned to have doppelgangers made of all of you and return them to your starship. Your shipmates would never have known the difference, and your replicas would have been in his power. Kirk frowned at her. Why? How does your Herr Elite keep the doppelgangers under control? I'd think they'd revolt. She shook her head. They dare not. Here in this room are the records for each doppelganger on Bavaria. Any sign of revolt from one of them, or any group of them, and the Herr Elite technicians simply come up here, take out that individual's record, and destroy him. Destroy him how? Spock asked. I don't know, but he simply disappears. Spock looked up and down the long banks of equipment, some of it recognizable, some not. Most interesting, he said. That's a great contribution, Kirk muttered. His own eyes were darting over the endless machinery. Scotty, comments? The engineer was scowling. His voice, as always when under pressure, had the heavy Scottish burr of his youth. I dunna know, he said. Man, it would take me forever to trace out the beastie circuits and figure out the workings of all this. Kirk darted a look at Anna. Where is everybody? How long will it be before somebody comes? She shook her head. Only a selected few of the Herr Elite technicians and scientists are allowed in here. They know how to operate and repair the equipment, but they can never rebuild it. Right now, they are all undoubtedly at the viewing screens watching the arena show. When it is discovered you have escaped, undoubtedly some will rush here. Kirk snapped. Scotty, Spock, get at it. Bones, any comments? McCoy's eyes were narrow in thought. Jim, as I remember, in the experiments that took place in this field long ago, the person duplicated had a matrix, a mold or impression. Wiped clean the matrix, and the duplicate simply reverted to the molecules of which it was composed. He made a motion toward the bank of files. Undoubtedly, those contain the matrices of every doppelganger on Bavaria, but beyond that, I know nothing. Kirk drew the communicator Anna had given him from the small pouch in his gladiator kilts and raised the antenna grid. Captain Kirk to the Enterprise. When Uhura's answer came, there was relief in the communications officer's voice. Lieutenant Uhura here, Captain. We've been worried about you. Is the ship still under fire, Lieutenant? Yes, sir. Not always, but intermittently. We don't dare lower the deflector shields. Mr. Sulu, please. Sulu's voice came through. Aye, aye, Captain. Mr. Sulu, get a fix on us. I want the ship's sensors and computers, the full efforts of the electronic brain of the Enterprise concentrated on this hull. The problem is to determine the workings of the equipment the hull contains. At once, Mr. Sulu. I'll keep in touch. Aye, aye, Captain. How much time do we have? None. Over and out. Kirk turned back to the others. Scotty? Scott and Spock had both been going from one piece of equipment to another, shaking their heads in bafflement. Time, Captain, Scott said. If I only had time, I could easily figure out every machine in the place. We need inspiration now. We don't have time. The most we can expect is 1 hour from the time we left the arena. Our absence will be discovered then, if not sooner. And we've already used the greater part of it getting here. Yeoman Janice Rand said in sudden excitement, Captain, that bank of dials and switches over there, the one with the impressive chair before it. Kirk looked at her, and then where she was pointing. What of it? There are a score of what are obviously some sort of control panels in this hall. But none with a chair that fancy. It must be the seat of someone particularly important. Kirk looked at Anna. Comments? She said slowly, I have been in here only once before. When I was a little girl, my father brought me. I think he sat there. Scott, Kirk snapped. See what you can find. The engineer hurried in the direction of the control banks in question. Behind them, they could hear the elevator begin to hum. The whole group hurried over to where Scott was staring down in despair at the electronic control board. Whoosh, man, I haven't time, he protested. He stared at dials, switches, buttons, and levers and shook his head. Kirk activated his communicator. Kirk to the Enterprise. Nothing? Uhura here, the voice came back urgently. No, sir. We've got the fix on your group, but so far nothing. Put the computer voice directly on. Aye, aye, sir. Scott had plumped himself down in the elaborate chair, his hands racing over the various controls, but he restrained himself from actually attempting to manipulate the devices he didn't understand. This red switch, he muttered. There's a wee control lock on it, to prevent it from being accidentally activated, undoubtedly. But what's it for? What does it do? He threw off the lock. I don't dare move it. Behind them a voice screamed, Don't touch anything! All spun around. Nummer 9 stood there, his eyes glaring madness. In his hand was one of the phasers he had appropriated from the captain and his group. Spock said mildly, I might point out that the weapon you hold is mine. While it was being taken from me, I shifted its selection lever to overload. I do not recommend that you press the trigger, Nummer 9. The robot-like computer voice of the Enterprise came through the communicator held in Kirk's hand. The red lever will wipe the matrices of every duplicated human being on the planet Bavaria. Don't touch! Nummer 9 began to shrill, and even as he did, he moved his gun hand in a spraying motion and depressed the trigger. He and that part of the room, including a sizable portion of the wall and elevator banks, blew up in a thunderous explosion. Unbelievably, none of the Enterprise contingent was harmed. Gathered around Scott before the control desk, they had been far enough off to be safe. Spock's eyebrows went up. As he stared at the body of Nummer 9 sprawled on the floor, he said, It would seem that he doubted my word. Kirk said to his senior engineer, All right, Scotty, throw the lever and let's see what we get. The engineer pushed it forward. Nothing seemed to have happened. But Janice Rand gasped, Look! And pointed. The fallen body of Nummer 9 had disappeared. Kirk held his communicator to his mouth. Kirk to the Enterprise. Yes, Captain. Sulu here. Is the ship still under fire? Not at the moment, Captain. Kirk looked at Anna. Are the phasers that have been bombarding the ship operated by Herelite or doppelgangers? Doppelgangers with the exception of a few Herelite higher officers. Can the higher officers operate the equipment without the aid of the men? I wouldn't think so. Kirk said into the communicator, Take a chance, Mr. Sulu. Drop the defensive screens long enough to bring us up. Notify the transporter room. Aye, aye, sir. Kirk turned to Anna Shekel. We'll leave now. There's nothing more for us to do. I would suggest you destroy this room and its contents with this phaser I'll leave you. Without the room, you and the others of the Herelite will have no doppelgangers to do your work and to maintain your military machine. That will mean you will have to buckle down for yourselves to a new way of life. Let us hope that in the future, when Bavarians reach out into space again toward neighboring planets, they will go in peace and with a real desire to help the others in their march to a higher state of civilization. Anna nodded. I have friends, of course. We have an underground organization which was directed against Bavaria's present policies. Not all of the Herelite believed in Nummer 9's teachings. She looked at Grang. Someday we may meet again, young man from Neolithia. I suspect that when you return, you will no longer be satisfied with stone weapons and skins to wear. You will be a spark that starts your people to resume the mark of progress. Grang said stiffly, I am not sure. We of the Wolves are a proud clan. However, he looked at Kirk, then Scott, and suddenly grinned. Nevertheless, I begin to suspect that iron makes a better blade than flint. Perhaps there are a few changes which might be made on Neolithia.